The wind howled like a wounded animal through the broken remains of the forest. Alexei stumbled forward, one gloved hand pressed tightly against his bleeding ribs, the other gripping a battered rifle whose strap had long since frayed into uselessness. His uniform, once proudly starched and pressed, now hung in torn, muddied strips from his body. Snow clung to his boots, his lashes, the tangled mess of his dark hair. Every step sank deeper into the frozen earth, and every breath burned like fire in his lungs. He had lost his unit 2 nights ago. The ambush had come fast and brutal. A spray of gunfire, the hiss of mortar shells, the screams of dying men. When the smoke cleared, Alexei found himself alone, his radio shattered, his bearings lost. The forest had swallowed him whole, its ancient, gnarled trees twisting together above him, blocking out the stars. No reinforcements, no orders, only the endless white wasteland stretching in every direction. The Russian soldier clenched his jaw, pushing onward. He was trained for this, to endure, to survive. Yet no training could have prepared him for the loneliness, the gnawing silence broken only by the distant echoes of artillery. Worse than the cold, worse than the hunger, was the gnawing sense of irrelevance. Here, in the endless woods, borders and flags meant nothing. There was only life and death, and both felt increasingly out of reach. Through the blur of frost gathering at the edges of his vision, Alexei spotted a break in the trees, a narrow game trail, half buried beneath fresh snow. With a grimace, he turned toward it, hoping it would lead him somewhere, anywhere. Hours blurred into an aching crawl of minutes. At some point, he found a frozen creek and followed it downstream, instinct telling him that where there was water, there might be life. Yet the forest remained stubbornly empty, a graveyard of skeletal trees and the distant cries of unseen creatures. Night fell like a hammer. Without shelter, Alexei huddled beneath the exposed roots of an ancient oak, wrapping his arms around himself to preserve what little warmth he had left. Hunger gnawed at his stomach, thirst parched his tongue. He dreamt fitfully of steaming borscht, of his mother's warm kitchen in Rostov, of laughter and music, dreams that tore at him when he woke shivering in the dark. By the second morning, delirium nipped at the edges of his mind. It was then he saw the movement, a flicker of color against the endless gray. At first, he thought it was a hallucination, a ghost summoned by his starving brain. But no, there it was again, a figure stumbling through the trees not far ahead. A soldier. At first, instinct roared inside him. Threat, enemy. He dropped into a low crouch, clutching his rifle to his chest, heart hammering in his ears. Through the branches, he glimpsed the figure more clearly. Slim, small, a Ukrainian uniform torn and bloodied. A woman moving with slow, pained determination, one arm clutched tightly against her ribs. Alexei tightened his grip on the rifle, conflicted. He should shoot. The war demanded it. His orders demanded it. But instead, he crept forward, silent as a ghost, snow muffling his steps. His breath came in slow, controlled bursts. As he neared, he could see her better. Tangled blonde hair, dirt-smudged face, eyes fierce despite the blood staining her uniform. She didn't see him until it was too late. With a swift, practiced motion, Alexei lunged, slamming her down into the snow. She struggled, surprisingly strong for her slight frame, but she was wounded and he easily overpowered her. She spat curses at him in Ukrainian, bucking and thrashing, but Alexei kept his knee planted firmly on her back, wrenching her arms behind her and tying them with a length of frayed cord he carried. When he finally rolled her onto her side, they locked eyes, hers blazing with hatred, his guarded and unreadable. For a long moment they stared at each other, their ragged breaths clouding the frozen air between them. In another life, he thought vaguely, she might have been beautiful. But in this one, she was his prisoner. Alexei hauled her to her feet roughly. She staggered but did not fall. Her chin jutted upward in defiance. "Move," He grunted in Russian, jerking his head toward the trees. For the first time in days, Alexei felt something other than cold and despair. He felt purpose, and somewhere buried deep beneath layers of exhaustion and duty, a flicker of something else ignited, something he couldn't yet name. The forest closed in around them, a maze of skeletal trees and deepening snow. Alexei trudged forward with grim determination, dragging his prisoner along by the length of cord binding her wrists. She stumbled more than once, but never cried out, her jaw set with unbreakable pride. He hadn't even asked her name. Some part of him told him it was safer that way. Names made things personal. Names made you hesitate. They had been moving for less than an hour when Alexei heard the low, throaty rumble. He froze, tightening his grip on the rifle. The woman stiffened too, her eyes darting into the trees. It was a sound he knew instinctively, even if he'd never encountered it in the flesh. The growl of a bear. Before he could react, a massive shadow exploded from the underbrush. The bear, gaunt from winter starvation, hurled itself toward them, snow spraying up in its wake. Alexei barely got his rifle up, squeezing off a shot that went wide. The creature slammed into him with bone-crushing force, knocking the weapon from his hands and sending him sprawling into the snow. Pain lanced through his body as the bear's claws raked across his side, tearing fabric and flesh alike. Alexei screamed, thrashing wildly. The beast reared back for another strike, and then a blur of motion, a shout. Olena! She had somehow wriggled free of her bindings, her fingers clutching a sharp fragment of wood. With reckless courage, she threw herself at the bear, jabbing the makeshift weapon into its flank. The beast roared, twisting away from Alexei and swinging its massive paw at her. She ducked under the blow, darting backward, shouting and waving her arms to draw its attention. Heart pounding, Alexei staggered to his knees, blood slick and warm against the freezing wind. His rifle lay half buried nearby. Gritting his teeth, he lunged for it, rolling over just in time to fire a second shot, this time striking true. The bear stumbled, bellowed one last furious roar, and crashed into the snow, twitching before going still. Silence fell like a heavy shroud. For long moments, neither of them moved, each gasping for air, hearts hammering. Finally, Alexei struggled to his feet, cradling his wounded side. His eyes met Olena's. She stood several meters away, chest heaving, hands trembling. They stared at each other, not as enemies, not as soldier and prisoner, but as two souls who had, for a fleeting moment, saved each other. Without thinking, Alexei slung the rifle back over his shoulder and stepped toward her. He pulled a knife from his belt, slowly, cautiously, and sliced the last of the frayed cord from her wrists. Olena rubbed her bruised skin, watching him warily. "Why?" she asked in halting Russian, voice raw. Alexei shook his head. "No more orders," he said simply. She stared at him for a long time, weighing the truth of his words. Then slowly, she nodded. For the first time since the war had torn their worlds apart, trust, fragile and trembling, began to grow between them. Together, wordless, they turned and trudged deeper into the forest, the corpse of the bear left behind, steam rising from its still warm body into the frigid air. And somewhere deep inside Alexei, something long frozen began to thaw. The snow fell heavier now, each flake a tiny dagger against the already brutal cold. The forest stretched endless and unforgiving before them, a monochrome maze where each step forward felt like defying death itself. Alexei pressed one hand tightly against his wounded side, grimacing with every breath. Beside him, the woman moved with cautious defiance, no longer bound by rope, but tethered to him by something even more delicate, necessity. She hadn't run when he freed her. She hadn't tried to kill him. They both knew that without each other, survival was a fading dream. "Olena," she said finally, breaking the brittle silence between them. Alexei blinked, the name hanging in the frozen air like a fragile promise. Alexei, he replied after a long pause. Names. Now they had names. They moved in silence for hours, pausing only when exhaustion forced them. When Alexei faltered, Olena caught his arm, steadying him with surprising gentleness. When she stumbled on hidden roots, he pulled her upright without thinking. Their uneasy alliance became a rhythm, a look, a nod, a hand extended wordlessly when needed. By nightfall, they found a hollow beneath a thicket of fallen trees, shielded from the worst of the wind. It wasn't shelter, not truly, but it was something. Alexei collapsed into the snow, his body trembling from cold and blood loss. Olena knelt beside him, assessing his wound with a practiced eye. Without a word, she ripped a strip from the hem of her uniform and pressed it against the gash in his side. Alexei hissed but didn't pull away. She worked quickly, binding the wound as best she could. When she finished, she sat back on her heels, studying him. "You need warmth," she said, her voice rough but not unkind. Alexei managed a weak, sardonic smile. "And firewood doesn't grow itself." She tilted her head, a ghost of a smile playing on her lips, the first crack in her armor. Leaving him tucked into the hollow, Olena scavenged fallen branches and dry moss, cursing softly when the wind stole the tinder from her fingers. After several agonizing attempts, she coaxed a small fire to life, its feeble flames flickering hungrily. They huddled close, the firelight painting their faces in shades of gold and shadow. For a long time, neither spoke. The crackle of the fire filled the silence between them, a tentative bridge across the gulf of their pasts. "Why did you save me?" Alexei asked eventually, his voice little more than a rasp. Olena shrugged, staring into the flames. "Because you're not my enemy anymore, not here." He considered that, watching the way the firelight caught in her tangled hair, the stubborn set of her jaw. "And you?" she asked after a beat, glancing sideways at him. "Why didn't you kill me when you had the chance?" Alexei looked away, the fire's glow blurring in his vision. "Because," he said quietly, "I'm tired of killing." Olena nodded, as if she understood in a way few could. The wind howled outside their fragile sanctuary, but inside, amid the smell of smoke and blood and earth, something rare took root, something neither war nor winter could so easily erase. Trust, or at least the fragile beginning of it. The fire crackled and hissed, battling against the cold that seeped in from every crack and crevice of their makeshift shelter. Outside, the snowstorm raged, blanketing the forest in a suffocating silence. But within the fragile circle of warmth they had built, another storm was beginning to calm. Alexei and Olena sat shoulder to shoulder, close enough to feel each other's shivers. The silence between them had shifted, no longer heavy with suspicion, but laden with unspoken stories. Olena was the first to break it. "I was a teacher," she said, her voice low, almost as if she feared the trees might overhear her confession. "Before all of this." Alexei turned his head slightly, studying her in the flickering firelight. There was a sadness etched into her features, a grief too old for someone so young. "History," she added, a faint, humorless smile tugging at her lips. "Irony, no? Teaching about wars that were supposed to never happen again." He huffed a quiet laugh, wincing at the pull of pain in his side. "I wanted to be an engineer," he offered, surprising himself with the admission. "Build things, bridges, cities." "Instead," Olena said, not unkindly, "we destroy them." Alexei nodded, the weight of it pressing down on him. For a long while, they simply sat, the fire warming their hands, but not their souls. Outside, the wind screamed, carrying with it the cries of a world that had lost its way. "Do you have family?" she asked, her tone careful, respectful of the wounds she might reopen. "A sister," Alexei said after a pause. "Yulia. She's smart, strong, probably hates what I became." Olena didn't respond immediately. She poked the fire with a stick, sending a shower of sparks into the air. "My mother and father," she said, voice tight. "Gone. A brother, missing since the first bombardments." The grief hung between them, an invisible thread binding their hearts in silent mourning. Without thinking, Alexei reached out, his fingers brushing against hers. She stiffened for a moment, then slowly, cautiously, relaxed. There, in the heart of the frozen wilderness, two enemies found common ground, not in their allegiances, but in their losses. Alexei swallowed hard. "I'm sorry," he whispered. Olena's fingers tightened around his, a simple human gesture that said more than any words could. They sat like that for what felt like hours, the fire dwindling to embers, the world outside fading into a distant nightmare. For the first time in a long time, Alexei dared to believe that there might still be something worth saving. Not nations, not borders, but the fragile, stubborn spark of humanity that refused to be extinguished. And in Olena's quiet strength, in her fierce sorrow, he found a reflection of his own battered soul. They were broken, both of them, but perhaps, together, they could be something more. As the fire burned low and sleep finally claimed them, Alexei realized he no longer felt quite so lost. The first light of dawn crept through the skeletal trees, casting a pale glow over the frozen forest. The storm had passed, leaving behind a heavy, oppressive silence. Alexei stirred from uneasy sleep, his body stiff and aching from the cold. Beside him, Olena slept curled tightly, her breath misting in the chill air. For a fleeting moment watching her, Alexei allowed himself to forget the war, forget the uniforms, forget the lines drawn in blood and hatred. She was simply a woman, and he was simply a man, both adrift in a world gone mad. But the real world had not forgotten them. A distant crunch of footsteps on snow shattered the fragile peace. Alexei tensed instantly, reaching for his rifle. Olena woke with a start, her hand darting instinctively to the knife tucked beneath her jacket. Their eyes met, communication flashing between them without a word. More footsteps, voices muffled but unmistakably Russian. "Patrol," Alexei breathed, his voice a ghost in the cold air. Panic clawed at his chest. If they were found, it would not matter that he was Russian and she was Ukrainian. They would both be seen as deserters, traitors, dead. Olena moved first, grabbing Alexei's sleeve and tugging him towards the trees. He hesitated, just for a moment, then followed. They abandoned the meager shelter and fled into the forest, weaving through the trees as silently as they could. Snow crunched underfoot, each sound a gunshot in the brittle morning air. Behind them, the voices grew louder, angrier. They ran until Alexei's wounded side burned and Olena's breath came in ragged gasps. Finally, they collapsed behind a fallen tree, hearts hammering. Pressed together in the narrow space, they could hear the patrol passing by, boots thudding, radios crackling. Alexei could feel Olena's heartbeat against his arm, a frantic rhythm that matched his own. Her face was close, too close, framed by strands of windswept hair, her cheeks flushed from exertion and cold. He realized he was staring and tore his gaze away, his throat tight. When the danger had passed and only silence remained, neither moved. The adrenaline that had fueled their escape now left them trembling, raw and exposed. Slowly, almost hesitantly, Olena reached out, brushing her fingers against Alexei's cheek, where a gash had started to bleed again. Her touch was light, tentative, as if she feared he might vanish. Alexei closed his eyes, leaning into the contact. Without thinking, without planning, he turned his head and pressed his forehead against hers. A breathless moment stretched between them, filled only with the whisper of the wind and the pounding of their hearts. And then, as naturally as breathing, Alexei kissed her. It was not a desperate kiss, not one born of lust or fear. It was soft, reverent, an acknowledgement of everything they had lost and everything they still hoped to find. When they broke apart, Olena rested her forehead against his, eyes closed. "We are fools," she whispered, a tear slipping down her cheek. "Maybe," Alexei murmured, his voice thick, "but for once, I don't care." For the first time since the war began, they chose something for themselves. Not survival, not loyalty, but love. Fragile and foolish though it was theirs. The morning dragged heavy and slow, each hour stitched with the low moan of a winter wind. Alexei and Olena sat close to the fading embers of their small fire, sharing what little warmth they could. Neither spoke much. Words seemed too fragile, too heavy with meaning after what had passed between them. It was Alexei who finally broke the silence. "We can't stay here," he said, his voice rough with fatigue and certainty. Olena nodded, brushing a lock of hair from her face. "The patrol will come back, with more men." They both knew it. Staying meant death. "South," Alexei said, sketching lines in the snow with a stick. "There's a ravine, deep and covered by trees. It leads to the river. If we reach the river, we might find a village. Supplies, maybe even a way out." Olena studied the crude map, her brows furrowed. "We have to move before nightfall," she said. "Together," Alexei added. He hadn't meant to say it out loud, but once the word was spoken, he couldn't take it back. Together. Not prisoner and captor, not enemy and enemy. Two souls stitched together by survival and something more. Olena didn't argue. She simply touched his hand, a silent promise. They packed quickly. A few strips of dried meat, a cracked canteen of water, a bundle of stolen rags for warmth. No weapons beyond Alexei's battered rifle and Olena's small knife. Poor armor against a world gone mad. The journey was brutal. The snow grew deeper, dragging at their legs. Alexei's wound reopened, seeping blood into the fabric of his jacket. Olena tied it tighter with trembling fingers, cursing under her breath in Ukrainian. They crossed the ravine by climbing down frozen rocks, slick with ice. More than once, Alexei slipped, and each time Olena's hands caught him, pulled him back from the abyss. By the time they reached the river's edge, the sky had darkened into bruised purple, and the first stars blinked overhead. Alexei collapsed to his knees on the snowy bank, gasping. Olena knelt beside him, brushing snow from his hair. "Rest," she said softly, "just for a moment." But even as she spoke, a sound shattered the hush of falling snow, the low mechanical growl of engines. They looked up together, fear tightening their chests. Across the frozen river, shapes moved. Vehicles, soldiers, Russian insignias flashing in the half-light. "They're searching," Alexei whispered. Olena grabbed his hand. "We have to go back, hide." But Alexei shook his head. "They'll find us, sooner or later." Their choices narrowed with the night. Run and be hunted, surrender and be executed, or split apart, scattering like broken pieces into the wilderness, each hoping the other might somehow survive. Alexei looked at Olena, really looked, the stubborn tilt of her chin, the fierce light in her eyes, the strength he had come to depend on. He squeezed her hand. "You have a chance," he said. "You know these woods. You can make it." "Not without you," she whispered fiercely. Alexei leaned forward, pressing his forehead to hers. "You must!" Tears burned his eyes, but he blinked them away. There was no room for weakness now. Slowly, painfully, he released her hand. Olena staggered back a step, shaking her head, refusing, but Alexei forced a small smile, the smile of a man who had already made peace with his fate. "Find the village," he said. "Live." And then, before he could break, before she could drag him back with her will alone, Alexei turned and stumbled into the shadows. Olena watched him vanish into the dark, her heart breaking with every step he took away from her. Above them, the first snowflakes of the night began to fall. erasing footprints, blurring the past, and burying their fragile dreams beneath a blanket of white. The forest swallowed Alexei whole. Each step away from Olena was agony, a tearing at his soul more painful than any wound. His breath came in ragged bursts, misting in the frigid air. As he stumbled through the deepening snow, his body barely more than a shadow among the trees. He could hear nothing now but the pounding of his heart and the whisper of the wind. No shouts of pursuit, no crackle of radios, only the deafening silence of choice and the consequences of it. Behind him, unseen, Olena hesitated. For a moment she stood frozen, torn between the desperate urge to chase after him and the knowledge that doing so would doom them both. Alexei had given her a gift, the sliver of a chance to survive. With trembling hands, she turned away. Olena moved swiftly, slipping through the trees like a ghost, her footprints vanishing almost as quickly as they appeared beneath the falling snow. She skirted the edges of the river, weaving between jagged rocks and frost-covered brush, every nerve screaming for caution. Time lost meaning. Each breath, each step was survival distilled to its purest form. She thought of Alexei's face, the rough stubble on his jaw, the way his eyes softened when he looked at her. She thought of his hand squeezing hers, of the weight of his forehead resting against hers as he whispered the impossible command to leave. Snow thickened into a near blindness. Olena stumbled once, twice, catching herself on tree trunks, ignoring the sting of frozen bark against her palms. Her body screamed for rest, but she pushed on, driven by a force stronger than fear. Hope. Somewhere ahead, past the endless expanse of white, was the village. Supplies, shelter, a chance to live for both of them. She would not let Alexei's sacrifice be in vain. The distant rumble of engines grew fainter, swallowed by the storm. Olena risked a glance over her shoulder. No figures moving through the trees, no flashlights cutting the gloom. Good, she pressed on. At last, as the first weak light of dawn seeped over the horizon, she crested a low ridge and saw it. Nestled among the trees, a scattering of dark shapes, roofs sagging under snow, smoke rising weakly from battered chimneys. A village. Relief buckled her knees, and she collapsed into the snow, sobbing with exhaustion and gratitude. But even as she dragged herself to her feet and staggered forward, a part of her heart remained behind, back in the shadows, back with the man who had taught her that even in the bleakest of winters, even in the blood and mud and ruin, love could still bloom, and she vowed silently, fiercely, that she would return for him, no matter what it cost. The village was a ruin of broken dreams and stubborn survival. Olena stumbled through the crooked streets, past shuttered windows and wary eyes peeking through cracked curtains. Her body was numb, her mind focused solely on staying upright, on finding shelter. An old woman opened her door a crack, and seeing the state Olena was in, beckoned her inside. Words were few and unnecessary. Hot broth was pressed into her hands, a threadbare blanket wrapped around her shoulders. She slept for a full day, drifting in and out of fevered dreams, faces from her past, the roar of artillery, Alexei's voice calling her through the snow. When she awoke, the world was still and pale with morning light. Driven by a force she could not name, Olena rose. She traded what few possessions she had, her knife, a silver locket, for supplies, a map, a battered rifle, a coat far too large for her frame. She asked around, careful not to reveal too much. Whispers spoke of a captured Russian soldier, wounded and defiant, last seen dragged toward a makeshift prison camp deep in the woods. Alexei, alive. Hope flared like a torch in her chest. With grim determination, Olena set out again, leaving the tentative safety of the village behind. Each step back into the wilderness was a step into uncertainty, but she no longer cared. The snow was lighter now, the sky streaked with the soft gold of approaching spring. Birds sang tentative songs from bare branches. The world, it seemed, dared to hope again. Hours passed, days. At last, cresting a ridge, she saw it, a line of prisoners shuffling through the snow, guarded by soldiers who looked as ragged and exhausted as their captives. Her heart leapt into her throat. There he was, Alexei. He moved stiffly, favoring one leg, his head bowed against the wind. But he was alive. Olena tightened her grip on the rifle. She could not storm the camp. She would not win in a fight against so many, but there were other ways. She watched, waited, planned, and when the moment came, a guard distracted a shift in patrol. She moved like a shadow through the trees. A single shot cracked through the air, echoing across the frozen fields. Panic spread through the ranks. In the confusion, Alexei stumbled into the trees where Olena caught him. For a heartbeat, they simply stared at each other. Then, without a word, he pulled her into his arms, and she buried her face against his chest, feeling the tremble in his body that matched her own. Together, they ran. They ran not toward a nation, not toward a flag, but toward each other, toward life, toward love. The war would rage on. But for Alexei and Olena, beneath the bloodied skies and broken earth, a new story had begun. One written not in conquest or defeat, but in defiance, in hope, and in the quiet, stubborn belief that even in the ashes, something beautiful could still take root and bloom.